Hello everybody, Carl here, and welcome to my big 2012 End of the Mayan calendar video. I'm being a little ironic. The Mayan calendar date, the chart that I'm looking at here for December, is in many ways anticlimactic. That is, it's anticlimactic if you are expecting some kind of big energetic blowout, some kind of cataclysmic confrontation between the forces of good and the forces of evil. What this chart shows us instead, I think, is something much, much more momentous, something much more meaningful, and in its way, kind of miraculous. I find it miraculous that the planet should have this big buildup, this big thunderous, titanic buildup of global events, looming catastrophes, seething civil wars, and so on and so forth, only to arrive at a point in December, big December 2012, the winter solstice, the end of the Mayan calendar, to show us a chart that really puts all of this on the individual and places the individual in an energetic situation, in an astrological situation where they are willing, ready, and able to wrestle the world, to wrestle all the forces of the world as individuals into shape that they would prefer, into more comfortable shape for the individual. That's pretty amazing, and I think it comes up more clearly in the video that I've managed to say it here. Now, I guess if you're looking for, and I don't want to demean or belittle this, if you're looking for some glistening New Age generalities or the usual pious New Age kind of verbiage about 2012 or disaster conspiracy theory stuff, you're not going to find that in this video. I suppose compared to these things, it might even be considered a little humdrum. But if you pay attention to the message here, I think you'll see, I think you'll agree with me that it's a very profound message and really in its way kind of wondrous. That all of this stuff, this huge, thunderous buildup, should take us to a moment where the responsibility is placed upon the shoulders of the individual and the power is placed in the hands of the individual. Okay, so let's go to the graphics and I'll have a couple of words at the end. I am basing December's analysis on a triple composite chart. It is based on data from the new moon on December 13th, the end of the Mayan calendar on December 21st, or what amounts to the same thing, the winter solstice 2012 on December 21st, and the full moon on December 28th. This chart encompasses, gives expression to all the themes that have become familiar from recent months. We see a deep transformation of personal identity, a progressive liberation and empowerment of women and the ascendancy of the feminine principle generally, a subtilization and spiritualization of intimate relationships, and on the macro or collective level, we see, in essence, a transformation of personal and governmental approaches to nurturance issues broadly defined, insurance, pensions, social welfare programs, and so on. It all sounds kind of dry and humdrum when you put it in such terms, but what we're talking about here is a very thoroughgoing, in-depth, prolonged transformation of every facet of personal life and collective life. And here, just as a point of reference, is the entire chart. I thought it would be good to put it out there before I launch into the detailed analysis. The first thing I want to point out about this chart is the fundamental orientation of the chart. We see Aquarius on the ascendant and Leo on the descendant. Now, this doesn't show up until and unless you add in the end of the Mayan calendar and the winter solstice as an extra data set in the composite chart. Okay, well, what we have is Aquarius on the ascendant opposing Leo on the descendant. Now, this points, as part of the fundamental fabric of the chart, to a tug of war or a pushing and shoving match between the higher self and the ego, or between the individual fighting for their own authentic identity and the group exerting pressure on the ego to behave the way the group behaves. Now, if we add in the aspects, to the chart, we see a cradle-like formation. Now, you can think of this as a womb, a cradle-like formation, but I also think of it as a kind of force field, a womb-like force field, a creative, dynamic force field that will help us individually and collectively give birth to a new global and individual identity. This structure, with the aspects all scrunched up there in the left personal side of the chart, empowers and obliges the individual to transform their response to stimuli from a Leo to an Aquarius impulse. So, for example, the individual is trying to be Aquarian. They're trying to be authentically, deeply themselves. That's on the left, on the ascendant. And you have all these group, ego-based impulses coming from the descendant, where Leo is. And we have to respond to these Leo, ego-based impulses coming from the group with an Aquarian impulse. So there's a fundamental tension, a creative, transformative tension between the individual, the world he or she lives in, and all the people and events that they encounter in that world. It's important to understand also that this chart really lacks exact aspects between the major planets. As a matter of fact, there are no really exact aspects between the major outer planets, those big era-defining, moment-defining aspects. And instead you have this force field, this creative force field that leaves the individual and the group to struggle between themselves, among themselves, so that the individual puts out an authentic Aquarian self-assertive vibe in response to the group-oriented, groupthink vibe coming from outside of them. And in the absence of any really dominant aspect, what we have is play. We have prerogative. The individuals are allowed to choose and to shape the response, much more so than if there were one of those big, bone-crunching, bunker-busting aspects dominating the month. Instead of having, say, a Uranus-Pluto square, an exact Uranus-Pluto square, we have a yod. Pluto in Capricorn, Saturn in Scorpio, and Jupiter retrograde in Gemini form a yod, and this yod has a very dominant influence on the entire formation, on the entire chart. Pluto is on the cusp of the 12th house, Saturn is in the 9th, and Jupiter is retrograde near the cusp of the 4th house, the Imum Coeli, to give it its Latin name. Essentially, then, there is a dialogue between Saturn and Pluto which are in mutual reception. This dialogue is informed by concerns arising from Jupiter's placement, or, in more specific concrete terms, power and authority represented by Saturn and Pluto are immersed in abstract, philosophical, religious concerns, matters of principle. They are involved in this kind of abstract debate about the economics of nurturance as they affect Jupiter at the base of the chart at the grass roots. The yod, with Jupiter's retrograde motion, takes the debate to increasingly deeper levels of analysis and understanding. This formation as a whole points to a profound transformation of attitudes towards nurturance and issues related to our responsibilities for others. This yod, then, with the planets of money, the planets of power, the planets of authority, this yod is pointing to profound changes, deep evolutionary trends in government programs related to nurturance issues. The shift will be of historic proportions. It will also be irreversible and have profound implications for the political, economic, and cultural life of our entire planet. You don't have these particular planets locked in this kind of formation without setting very, very long-term processes in motion. The decisive factor, the decisive power in this yod is Jupiter in the driver's seat. Now, Jupiter is in the fourth house. It's near the cusp of the fourth house, and the fourth house is the natural house of Cancer, which is the sign of nurturance par excellence. And we also know that Jupiter is exalted in Cancer. So we have this very strong, very conspicuous, very dynamic influence on the issue of nurturance. And more specifically, nurturance at the grassroots level. And we have a retrograde Jupiter, which generally indicates a deepening of understanding, a necessity to dig ever deeper, in the yod, a formation which itself is related to a constant digging deeper, a constant search for deeper, more comprehensive understanding. So the basic structure is one that drills down, gets into the weeds, goes deep. However, it's more than that. It goes unusually deep, and much deeper than anything we have seen yet would lead us to believe. Pluto and Saturn at the top of the chart are part of a fairly extensive stellium, and Jupiter at the bottom of the chart is part of its own fairly extensive stellium. So we're really talking about a really complex, in-depth, multi-layered, multifaceted sort of dialogue. So, amplifying the Saturn-Pluto vibe, we have Juno, the Sun, Mercury, Venus, and the North Node up there with Saturn and Pluto at the top of the chart. Let me run through a little textbook stuff here to give you some idea of what's involved. Pluto governs all power and control issues. Juno governs church and state-sanctioned life bonds or life partnerships like marriage or domestic partnerships. The Sun governs the higher, more conscious, voluntary aspects of our identity, of our personality. Mercury governs communication, broadly defined. Venus governs beauty, love, and the affections generally. The North Node indicates the proper focus of our efforts at any given point in time, in any given situation. And Saturn indicates the limitations we are working against, the pressures we are having to bear. All of these bodies, all of these points, all of these themes up there are at work in the 9th, 10th, and 11th houses in signs governing things like collective authority, governing philosophy, social responsibility, as well as stuff like religion, metaphysics, theology, philosophy, ideology, all of these things that relate to those abstractions by which we seek to understand and regulate our affairs. All of these placements in this part of our yod point to a concerted, more or less cooperative effort to develop a new set of guiding principles at high levels in society and government, principles that will guide us in resolving the many, many vastly important nurturance issues that many of our societies are facing at this time. This wide-ranging discussion going on at the top of the chart is focused on and guided by considerations arising from a stellium at the bottom of the chart, a small group of planets surrounding Jupiter. It is guided by considerations arising from the south node, Jupiter, of course, Lilith, Vesta, and Ceres in Taurus, Gemini and Cancer in the 3rd, 4th, and 5th houses, grassroots houses, houses that clearly have to do with the little guys, the 99%. The south node tells us what to avoid, what approaches to avoid, what attitudes, feelings, prejudices we need to let go of, where we need fresh, enriched insights, all with respect to nurturance at the grassroots level. Jupiter governs wealth and growth, very generally defined. I mean, it isn't just money, it's food, it's opportunity, it's education, and it's healthcare, all of that stuff. Lilith governs the emergence and empowerment of women and the feminine principle generally. Vesta governs dedication to an ideal. Ceres governs nurturance issues generally, birth, death, nourishment, cultivation, all those issues very basic to the support of life. Overall, these placements at the business end of the yod, at the bottom of the chart, point to the need for a thorough rethinking of the concept of nurturance with a focus on the effects of these new ideas on nurturance at the grassroots level. It also points to an emphasis on the role of women in society and feminine empowerment generally, or the empowerment of the feminine in all of us, male, female, and so on. Okay, Lilith, Vesta, and Ceres are all strongly and closely associated with the feminine. So are Cancer and the 4th house, nurturance in general. So this little stellium at the business end of the yod around Jupiter tells us once again how very important the issues surrounding nurturance are, the caring for, the cultivation, the support of human life. Summing up now before moving on, the yod, which pretty much dominates the chart, drives, motivates a deep, intense, wide-ranging, protracted debate over nurturance issues at the highest levels of government and society, especially as these things affect the quality of life at the grassroots level and the empowerment and the support of the feminine. The placement of the moon's nodes prioritizes the transformation of attitudes and the elimination of bias related to nurturance issues at all levels. Okay, now, the next phase of our analysis. There is a group of planets in the leftmost part of the chart, the personal part, which point to deep, intense, once again, deep and intense personal transformation. This is a deep and intense chart. I'm not just repeating these buzzwords. It's really happening in this chart. This personal transformation has a decidedly radical, revolutionary flavor and emphasizes the effort on the part of individuals to express the higher self, to express their higher self, despite ego-based pressure, or pressure coming from the egos of other people, or from the level of group think, group pressure, which is basically ego-based. Mars represents the masculine principle generally. By sign, it is strongly placed here. It is exalted in Capricorn. It is reinforced by Pluto on the cusp of the 12th house, also in Capricorn. Going by its house placement, however, in the house of Neptune, this is a volatile, idealistic placement, not particularly ideal for Mars. It's idealistic, but not ideal for Mars. Mars and ideals, they tend not to mix too well. You get a lot of zealotry, fanaticism, extremism, all that questionable stuff. So this Mars placement is complex and paradoxical, but not necessarily in a good way. From the point of view of house placement, Mars and Neptune are in mutual reception. I think they call that lesser reception or something. Anyway, it is a lesser form of mutual reception. This points to a deep spiritualization of the Mars principle. And once again, man, when you're talking about Mars and spiritualization in the same breath, in the same sentence, I think you're talking about trouble. If you think the word trouble is a little too negative, then let's just say Mars and spirituality is a very problematic combination. Basically, then, this placement is far from optimal for Mars and Neptune, despite the mutual reception by house, despite the strong placement of Mars, despite the strong placement of Neptune. Here, I think you have strongly placed planets placed in a way that their strength, the strength of these placements, work against them. Okay, enough with the paradox. Let's move on. Neptune and Chiron are strongly placed in the first house in Pisces. Neptune, of course, is especially strongly placed because it governs Pisces. This suggests an expansion and a spiritualization of the sense of self. We will tend to overflow, to want to overflow the boundaries of our ego, of our individualistic selves. And it also points to a lessening of materialistic motive. Our involvement with material things will change and go in a non-materialistic direction. Pallas is also in Pisces, but it's further along in the second house. This points to a transformation of our spending patterns, making our spending habits, our attitudes toward spending more socially aware, more socially conscious, and more consistent with our evolving, more spiritualistic, more highly idealistic sense of self, of who we are. In our three-way composite, the moon conjoins Uranus. This contact is exact to within 17 minutes of arc. This is extremely close. And it's in the second house. This means that the personality, represented by the moon, is suffused with revolutionary Uranian energy. And since it's all in the second house, it's leading to a desire for economic reform and the use of grassroots economics to bring reform. But I think we can interpret this broadly to mean also that people are going to want a better deal at the cash register. People don't want to be treated the way they have been being treated by businesses. They want a better deal on Main Street at the grassroots for the little guy, for the 99 percenters. These placements point to a transformation and spiritualization of the most basic facets of personal identity, accompanied by a very strong drive to express these newly evolving inner changes outwardly and concretely. People want to see these things manifest in their world, and they're going to try to make it so. And we want to recall that transformative matrix, the matrix of aspects that are crowded into the left hand, as you face it, the left hand eastern part of the chart, the personal side of the chart. This is the matrix of aspects we discussed at the beginning of the analysis that will motivate and empower people to transform the events, the experiences, the people, the circumstances around them, the things going on in front of them, to transform these things in an Aquarian direction, in a direction dictated by impulses coming from people's higher, authentic selves. Now, we have one more placement I want to discuss. The part of fortune, as I explained last month, or was it the month before? Anyway, it combines the energy of the ascendant, the moon, and the sun, all of the points in the chart that most powerfully define the individual, their fate or their destiny, their identity. In December, the part of fortune is near the cusp of the 8th house, the house preeminently of nurturance issues. As you know, the part of fortune is a harbinger of high positive synchronicity, and this placement of the part of fortune strongly supports the effects of all the placements already discussed. In other words, this placement of the part of fortune close to the cusp of the 8th house indicates strong support for those who are actively experiencing and actively trying to externalize the deep personal transformation that this chart supports. It also indicates strong support for trying to create or adjust to the reform of nurturance policies, new nurturance programs, and the availability or lack of availability of resources. This is a very strong, very supportive, very facilitating placement, and we should be very grateful for it. What I'd like to do now is put December's chart, composite chart, in the broader context. I'd like to link it to charts going back to October, when this new planetary arrangement with Saturn in Scorpio formed up. This new planetary arrangement, the one that came into being in early October, pointed to an end to disaster consciousness, a need to get beyond the expectation that the end of the world was around every corner, that financial collapse and so on and so on and so on, that kind of stuff. We needed to get beyond that. This formation allowed us to. It told us to. It promised an end to the stalemate, indecision, and drift that has characterized so much of government activity or government inactivity. It promises also an end to frustrating, destructive, sterile confrontations with authority. It promises a lessening of irrational, freakish behavior and a decrease in the influence of demagogues and extremists. And while that is still, all these things are still very much with us, I think you'll have to agree that since October, we've seen a noticeable decline in these things. Let's now rearrange these planets so we can see more clearly how they relate to December's chart and add in the yod from December's chart and see what we got. You can see the lines there that connect the yod to the larger formation already in place. The lines are somewhat more scraggly. Okay, so that yod that drives the winter solstice chart, the end of the Mayan calendar chart, the December chart, this yod which drives that chart taps directly into the power of this new, more benevolent arrangement of the outer planets, including Saturn. Now I think you see very clearly that the yod, which drives the December chart, taps directly into the power of the new planetary arrangement, but also it taps into the two planets, Saturn and Pluto, that have the most irresistible, the most forceful, concrete material effects. Saturn's discipline, wisdom, reason, and authority predominate. Pluto's worldly power is behind the effort to bring better life conditions to the grassroots. The entirety, indeed, of the new planetary arrangement is caught up in the drive for fundamental economic reforms to benefit the 99%. In my opinion, the chart that we just discussed, or the picture that it shows us of what's going on in the heavens, has important, profound implications for the very long term, in my opinion. To be honest, I have no simple, clear-cut, textbook reasons for concluding that this chart has implications for the very long term. My conclusion is just based on my own understanding of the way astrology works, the way these planetary energies work, something that has evolved slowly in my mind over a long period of time. My reasoning goes something like this. This chart encompasses the 2012 winter solstice, and winter solstices tend to have a determining effect on the year that follows. It also encompasses the end of the Mayan calendar, and I have my own reasons based on a close study of the chart for the end of the Mayan calendar in believing in the power of that chart. Another thing that helps convince me of the power and the importance of this chart for the long-term future is that it embraces all of the important themes of our times in a single, harmonious, supportive formation. It constitutes a culmination, not a climax, not another big explosion, not a cliff, but a kind of summation and culmination, and it makes it a very personal thing. It gets all of these huge themes, these big, difficult, world-shaking themes, and it scrunches them all together and turns them into a highly energetic, transformative confrontation between the individual and their environment. It makes it personal, it makes it real, and it empowers the individual. My final reason in believing in the long-term relevance of this chart is a simple mechanical one, so to speak. Once you set such powerful forces, once you unleash such powerful forces, they don't just peter out, disappear, or evaporate in a month. It takes a long time for these energies to completely manifest, for all the processes that they set in motion to play out. And if you look at the kinds of things going on in this chart, you're talking about things that can take a lifetime or more to reach completion. So for me, that is the message of the big 2012 chart, the end of the Mayan calendar. It's a chart that turns the everyday existence and our individual lives into a revolutionary, transformative field where we have all these visions of the future. Many people have put forward such visions. They've looked forward to these titanic battles between good and evil. This chart takes all that and puts it right on the individual, in the individual life, on your shoulders, in your life. The world is going to become the world that we as individuals make it. That's what this chart says. That, I think, is the message of 2012. Maybe a little anticlimactic, but I think my view is it's frankly a spectacular kind of thing. That's a spectacular outcome. Okay, we'll see you next time, and that'll be in, I guess sometime in December. We'll talk a little bit about 2013. See you then. Bye-bye.